And yes, in this little library, we are gonna discuss different type of tabletop RPGs in a point of view of a newcomer to it. And yes, I have played a few tabletop RPGs before. For example, Call of Cthulhu, Pokemon. I know I've done, and another one which I don't know. Two other I don't remember the name of. But those are basically it. So today's topic, as the viewers can see on the side there, and you listeners are gonna realize, is Fabula Ultima, which is a tabletop JRPG. So yeah, that is basically the setting for the whole thing as well. Like, it is called a JRPG because it is taking inspiration from a lot of JRPGs for mostly, well, majorly, not mostly perhaps, but majorly from Final Fantasy. And I am not joking with that because they do actually quote one of the Final Fantasy villains in the beginning of that book, which is hella fun to be honest. But yes, but I really personally I do like this game. I have not tried it before, but I am working a bit with it. So I'm a bit new, but that is the point with this little podcast. So basically, this was actually made in October 2022 by Need More Games. I myself got it last year, and they've already published four different extra books, expansions. One for techno fantasy and one for high fantasy, together with the game master's own little book for easier ruling, if we say so. I'm also gonna bring up the book on my phone because I have it there, which is really wonderful, just for me to easily read it without having to go through my computer and do stuff. There we go. But yes, so out of the box, most games have a certain set. For those who knows tabletop RPGs and just are experts on this or have experience with this, knows that you can basically create your world however you want. Of course, there are a few games that decides mostly that everyone gonna make the world together. This is, in a sense, one of those games because there are a few rules that you basically build the world together with your players and go from there, which in a sense is both good but not the easiest if you have like a certain scenario you want to do, because then that means you need to have a certain style of how things will go. But yeah, out of the box setting is, as I said, JRPGs, which is like many of the Final Fantasy 1, 2, 3, even up to 7 as an examples. And the three main categories of these settings are natural fantasy, which I've not heard too much about, but I do know of another tabletop RPG that I will discuss in later episodes that is basically only a natural fantasy. And what that means, it does have the need for heroes and need for people to defend others, but it's not as, how do you say, like epic in a way, like in Final Fantasy. In like many JRPGs, you have like the demon lord, you have the ruler of the monsters and things like that that only the hero can actually deal with. Ooh, nice. Just read something in chat. But yes, so in that, you more or less are someone that wants to help people. Because the quote on natural fantasy in the book is that it's about warmth and community with nature and beasts, and the calamity that befalls when hearts are twisted. So it's more of a more calm and collected way of doing a fantasy. Not so much like the Lord of the Rings, Mordor, and everything like it. Everything just goes to chaos. This is things are going bad, but it is not like the world's destroyer is on its way. But then we also have the second fantasy type. Well, both all of them are three fantasy types, but the second one is high fantasy, which can be explained easily like one of the earlier Final Fantasy games. Swords, shields, magic, even like a few of the Dragon Quest games. You don't have so much technology, but you have a lot of different magic. Another good example for which I can say for myself is Tales of some Fantasia. That was the name of it. I do mix them together sometimes because in that game, some of the people know how to use magic, while some don't, and there are also the spirits that you can get help from. And in that game, there are basically the one that wants to rule the world and change people's hearts and everything like that. And that is what high fantasy is. A lot of magic, like the whole world is just rich of magic and experiments with magic. A few technologies, like for example, in many games with a generic name of Magitech, of course, then which are a few examples like magic weapons and things like that. But then we also have the third setting of this game, which is techno fantasy. Technically, in a sense, it still is like both the others. There are magic, there are mysterious things, and there are the really bad people trying to take over the world. High fantasy is when you add 90 elves to the setting. You could guess that, but it could be for some people. But yes, I also do read chat because this is live on Twitch. So if you ever hear a question or something that I read out, that is from the wonderful chat. But yes, the Techno Fantasy is easily explained as Final Fantasy VII and forward, where you, for example, is able to ride a bike, you have the motorcycle, you have all the vehicles, you even have some mechs you're gonna have to fight, and like the buildings are basically just made of metal and alloys. So yes, so the Techno Fantasy is a lot of there is magic, but it is kinda pushed down by the technology that exists in the world. And together with that, there even is more of traveling between worlds. Of course, if you have the setting for any of the fantasy types, you can still travel between different realms and do stuff like that. But in this, they do focus on it being more of a sci fi fantasy rather than being a magical fairy tale fantasy, if we say so. So that is a bit of the setting, but as I said, most people that does make the worlds does make the rule themselves. So these are out of the box settings of if you want to create one of these places, then here are a few tips. But other than that, they do have a few examples. If you create a world, there are a few things to think of. So, for example, they have the 8 pillars in the game, which is that there are a lot of ancient ruins and harsh land because you need to create a few dramatic places to more or less put your people in. A world in peril, as we discussed, either the change of people's heart in natural fantasy or the demon overlord in high fantasy that just wants to take over the world. Clashing communities is another one of the pillar. You perhaps want everything to be peaceful directly, but most of the times it is not, and that does bring your players to want to figure out how to deal with it or how to do things, which I feel is kind of good. Everything has a soul. Of course, like giving as much as you can life in the games when you do a tabletop RPG is a good thing. Like they don't need to have the biggest backstory. But that's the tip I got from world building. Do give some people some stuff. For example, I had created a few citizens that are meaningful for some of the communities, while most other people are people just living there. You just give them how they look, a name, or stuff they do. And yeah, then that has a soul. But even more things can have a soul, like the monsters or creatures that also roams that world. Then another pillar is magic and technology. As I said, high fantasy is more of magic than it is of technology, and techno fantasy is more of technology than magic. So it is a bit of like a clashing there. You have to choose how you want your world to be. Is it gonna be a mix of both, more of the other, or less of the other? And then we have heroes, have many sizes and shapes. This kind of game, as they write in the book, is that you are not just a person that are mixed into this randomly. In a sense, yes, you are randomly, you are the player and you play this. But it is meant for you to be the hero, as for when you play normal JRPGs. You might be playing some person that might not know anything or might not be involved at first, but then you become the hero. Everything revolves around you. And then mystery, discovery, and growth. That like all of these 8 pillars are wonderful, especially for this kind of game, because that is tips of how to basically build up the world for Fabula Ultima. Now, what I think is really good with this game is that it is kind of welcoming with the rule sets, because I have tried a few rules with D&D before or other, for example, Call of Cthulhu. I'm not gonna try and weigh one more than the other. This is more a discussion of people who knows them. But there is a lot of dice sizes and a lot of things to do and a lot of math. There's always going to be math in these games, but this one kind of has a way of doing it a bit simpler. Because your stats are based upon 4 different things, which is dexterity, or 4 different attributes, which is dexterity, insight, might, and willpower. Basically, none of these, they do have a meaning in a sense because, of course, dexterity is how quick you are, insight, how clever I would say you are, or how noticeable you can see things and stuff like that. Might, of course, is strength, and willpower is like wisdom. But other than that, you're kind of free of mixing and matching however you want with any sort of thing, especially for the skill checks, because these 4 attributes are not that difficult to gain because you only use a certain die for each one. Most attributes in other games has a certain value, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way up to 16 perhaps, and then you add that one together with the dice. In this game, your attribute is the size of the dice, which means that your attribute can only be 6, 8, 10, or 12. Why that is because of the 6-sided dice, the 8-sided dice, the 10-sided dice, and the 12-sided dice. So instead of having to mix and match with all the math and everything, if you get a skill check, you basically just roll your attributes. For example, if you get a dexterity might, for example, then you roll the size of your might, which might be 10, and your dexterity, which is 6, and then you add those two together. Because yes, most of the skill checks in this game is based upon 2 attributes. Of course, you perhaps just want people to be fast. That doesn't mean you're gonna need to have like, oh, you're gonna have dexterity and insight because they need to see where they go. You can basically have dexterity, but they always gonna be 2 attributes of the skill checks. So if you ever need someone to be fast, you just say to them, oh, this is a double dexterity skill check. What do? They roll the dice size of their dexterity, which might be 8-sided this time. Add those two together, and if it is enough to actually be able to clear it, then they clear it. Which is, it's an interesting and easy way to do things, because most of these games does have a certain, if you are above this value, you succeed. This game is no difference, because if you're capable of succeeding here, then you succeed. And if you have not enough, then you do not succeed. There are, of course, a few similarities with other games. Let me just check here. For example, the fumble and the critical success. So basically, when both dices would say 1, that's when you fumble, which is understandable. It is like a D&D's natural 1. But yes, because you need 2 dice in this one all the time, as long as both of them shows 1, you fumble. Most of the time, fumbles means nothing really bad particularly happen, but it gives the DM a little extra boost. A little opportunity of his is able to set in. For example, the people chasing you is capable of catching up. You were not as sneaky as you thought you were, and stuff like that. And yes, there is another thing that is together in this rule set, which is we're gonna go to together here as well, and that is the fabula points or ultima points, depending on who you are. If you get a fumble, that is of course a bad thing to get, but you also get something from it, and that is something called a fabula point, which basically isn't like anything too specific in the game set. It's just that you can use it to change things a bit to your advantage. Fabula points is for the players, and Ultima points is for the game master. So Fabula points could be that you just get some sort of advantage by adding an element. Like for example, I used my Fabula point to, I don't know, something's gonna happen, we get help. So it could just be that by pure chance, an ally of theirs come to help them. Of course, you're gonna have to figure out why the ally is there and what is going on, but it basically adds a bit more of a verbal thing to things is getting a bit better for you. Of course, as I said, even the game master gets one of these points, which is called ultima points. Not when the players fumble, but they basically gain them depending on what sort of enemy you meet. Because the enemy is the one that has the ultima points, not the game master themselves. And they themselves can basically escape, invoke a specific thing happening, or to recover, depending on what the game master wants them to do. For example, the game master perhaps wants them to live another day and ruin the player's time. Then it could use a ultima point to basically escape, which means that there is no way for them to try and catch up at this moment. So this is a bit of more of a narrative advantage depending on what's happening. So whenever the game master creates a minor or major villain, they gain a certain amount of ultima points, which can be used depending on what the settings need. But fabula points, which is the players, are gained by basically fumble. You do something that is not meant to happen, then you're just managed to not do it. Of course, you can get a critical success as well, and that is if you manage to get a double number of the highest number. Or, well, higher than 6. For example, the lowest of the dice you can have in this game is a 6-sided dice. If you get 2 sixes, you basically get a critical success, which also will give you a certain opportunity, which could be many different things. For example, you can give an affliction to one of your enemies, you can earn someone's favor, or things like that. Sometimes a bit more active things, and sometimes a bit more story-wise things. But yes, it depends. It doesn't matter what sort of double number you get, as long as you can get them. The minimum one is 6 because of the 6-sided dice, and the maximum is 12. Then between that, you can get a double 7, double 8, double 9, 10, and 11. And at that point, you basically get a critical success. Something though that is kind of different. Well, kinda. It is quite different to any other role-playing game I have met is the battle. Because as I said, one of the biggest inspiration to this game is JRPGs. JRPGs. Sorry for me fumbling that word. But basically, most of those games are turn-based. You basically stand in a line together with your enemies, and you can basically go one by one. This is how the battle works here as well. So unlike many other games where you have movement and actions, you only have certain actions, which could be many different things. It could be attack, it could be research because you want to know what the enemy is weak against, it could be defense, or it could be fixing the active clock, which I will go through what it means for something. But yes, so that is the difference with this. You don't have a battle progression. Well, what do we think? What could we call it? I kind of forgot the name of it, but basically, you don't go who is faster in a sense. The only one you check first. Yes, there is no movement action or reaction. There are a few reactions, but it depends on what skills you have and what skills your enemy has. Because there are, for example, a few monsters that can be created. That, for example, has, if it is attacked by magic, it might just attack back. So there are reactions, but they are more of a skill rather than an active thing. But yes, there are no movement. Movement in battles are nothing more than cinematic. So even if I say you stand in a line, that's the visual point of it, like many other old JRPGs. But for example, let us easily say that you are the hero that was basically is gonna try and attack your fear, like your biggest enemy. What you basically narrative might be that you run up to him, dodge behind him, and attack him from behind. That doesn't do any sort of effect. Whether or not you hit or not is by the dice. But the running and what you do doesn't really give much of an advantage. So any sort of movement or other things like that is nothing more than cinematic, a bit of more play of the mind, which of course many of these games are, definitely, which does help a bit but also feels a bit odd, which I can actually say personally. Because not having movement makes some of the skills you have a bit odd. Because yes, you can of course as a DM decide to do movement and things like that. But there are a few skills like any enemy you see or any enemy that can hear you. Basically to say, because there is no movement, they will always be there. But I would then say also that that can be worked around by having people move around cinematically. They hide behind trees, they are too far away and stuff like that. And by that, they cannot be seen nor can they hear you. But yes, other than that, there is no sort of movement in this game and has to basically be made up. But other than that, how the turn is going with this game, as I said, is that no one is really faster than the other. Most of the time, you basically take the player and the fastest initiative, the player with the fastest initiative, and the fastest initiative enemy, and roll a initiative check. Whoever is faster takes the turn first. But after that, you can basically come up with any sort of strategy you want. For example, the players might be the one that comes in first. They decide that the shielded knight is going to take the first action because he is capable of defending everyone else. Then they let him do it first. And then perhaps the enemies decide that that guy is the strongest, he goes first. Now, the second round, you can basically decide anything else. You can just say that, okay, they don't have that much health. Let's the mage do a lot of damage to everybody. So how the turn work is that you alternate between enemy and ally, depending on who comes first. But other than that, the players are free to choose whoever they want to actually do. But yeah, so other than that, there are a few actions to the battle. which is, of course, the normal attack, which doesn't need to be explained. You can use your weapon, roll the set of attribute dice you need, the skill checks, and then do damage there. Most of the attacks does bear the same similarities, which is the skill check first, where you roll 2 dices, and the damage most of the time is actually changing, because unlike many other games where it does a certain set of damage, and sometimes some other times they have new set of dice, this attack actually uses the same dice as your skill check, because the damage is always noted as high roll plus extra damage, which could sometimes be 5 and sometimes be 10, depending on what sort of weapon you're using. But what it means by high roll is that if you, for example, roll a d6 and a d8 for attack, and let us easily say the biggest number on either dice is 7. You get a 2 on the d6 and you get a 7 on the d8. That means that you do, let's say, 10 plus 7 damage. And then, yes, of course, because this is a JRPG, every enemy and sometimes even ally have different attributes they're either strong against or weak against. So you can basically attack them with an, let us easily say, a sword with water element or ice element, depending on what you feel for. And it could be that you're attacking something that actually has resistance to water. That means that they will actually take less damage. Or it could be worse than that, it could be immune to it and don't take any damage at all. Or actually the worst possible idea, it could actually absorb the damage instead, just because of the element of your weapon. So there are a few elements like poison, dark, light, even physical, because some weapon doesn't have an element, but some creatures, badly enough, might actually be resistance against physical attacks. Which is really nice that they actually have that, a little extra thing to do. But yeah, then you also have, for example, the equipment action. Unlike many other games, you actually don't have an inventory. You can say, of course, that you have things, for example, for purposes. You need to find the golden statue of some sort of ruins. You can always note that you have that in your inventory, but it's not in a active inventory. For example, arrows, bombs, things like that. You don't have that. What you have is something called inventory points. So basically, by taking the inventory action in a battle, you perhaps want to heal yourself with a health potion, or you restore more mana with a mana potion. What you use is basically the inventory action to pay the cost of what you have in your inventory. So anything that you basically have, like, oh, I have this kind of item and that is mostly just narrative. So whenever people goes into town, you can of course say that you just restock everything you need. Because yes, inventory points can only be restocked in the towns. Otherwise, it would be kind of interesting to have an unlimited amount of potions, which would not be kind of fun. And of course, equipment action. If you need to change weapon or change gear and stuff like that, that's the action you take. Guard action does have a kind of neat thing, which, as I talked about, you had different immunities or vulnerabilities depending on what you fight. By guarding, you are actually guarding yourself even to those alignments. So, for example, when you take the guard action and someone attacks you with light, you are resistant to the light damage and will then take less damage. Hinder, you basically give the enemies a status effect. It could be dazed, it could be slow and stuff like that, because all of these have a certain event for any sort of NPC, even the players. For example, the slow will cause your player to actually lose 1 dexterity dice, which means that if you have a dexterity dice of 8, it will become 6 as long as you are slow, because it will always go down to the next die size which it is. Then objective, as I talked about before, the clock event. Clocks in these games is something I have never really heard about before. They did describe it that it did exist somewhere else in another game, but I personally have never been through any sort of tabletop RPG having clocks. And what a clock is, well, it is kind of self-explanatory. It is how much time or events for something to happen. For example, you are in a fight and someone of the enemy is trying to activate a, let us easily say, a ancient mechanical golem that will start attacking you. Because it could stop the battle completely, you will basically be. They will basically need a. What is it? A six base clock. Basically, there's 6 segments to the clock, and when you actually take the objective, you somehow, in a narrative way, try to stop them from doing this. So if it is I think it either was a 4 or a 6, but if it is a 4 segment clock, you somehow manage to do something better, which means that the golem might wake up. But because of how damaged it is, it only has half HP. If you have a 6 clock, it might actually do that you stop the golem from working completely. And a 12, that might just stop the whole battle from even continuing because they realize how bad it is. So clocks are basically depending on events. You have like one clock for if the enemy is gonna do a certain thing, so it might just take them 4 objectives to be able to do something, and some other things might just take 6, depending on what's happening. So these clocks are a sort of thing of being able to make sure to check how much time is needed. Because sometimes you might just, in a tabletop RPG, have it will take them 5 days to do something. And that is absolutely understandable. You can have a clock that has 5 segments for each day. But here you can also have the depending on objective. That's easy to say that the person trying to awaken the golem isn't as smart as he is. That means that sure, he might just need 4 segments to start it up. But he also does need to use a skill check to see if he can. And if he fails that, then it's going to be more than just 4 turns. So these clocks are useful. I'm still trying to learn a bit about them because of how they could be used, because they're not just in battle. They could be, as I said, how many days does it take for the enemy to mobilize their forces? Let's easily say a week, 7 days, 7 days clock. So you could do it like that. So these objective things, of course, you can do it outside of battle, but does need a bit of tweaking depending on what things gonna need or what's gonna happen. But it is absolutely a very interesting mechanic. I can absolutely say that. So these are a bit of the rule sets, of course, which personally I feel they aren't too bad even for a beginner player, because you don't need too much math for the attacks, skills, or even the skill checks. Because the only thing you need to do is 2 dices and add them together, and whether you fail or succeed is depending on how much you actually need to reach. So I have tried to just make a character and try this out myself. Like, can I actually just do this? Can I defeat this thing? That worked. Can I do this? That worked. So, yes, it is not the most difficult, but also not the most easiest, because the clocks and, for example, the fabula and ultima points and stuff like that, that does thing have, of course, a bit of need for managing and trying to figure out how they work. But other than that, I feel like rather than having a lot of math adding together for each advantage, disadvantage, plus the relic you have there and plus this you have there, this feels rather more welcoming that you don't have too many attributes and too many values to add together. And then we have the creation, which I have basically added into two segments, which is basically customization and character creation. In the base book, which is the Fabula Ultima JRPG, you basically have 15 base classes. Now, these classes aren't like when you play other games, because other games you might be the cleric that have learned a bit how to be I don't know, a warlock because he wants to do more magic. You're not this person also doing that. You are not this class with also this class. In this game, the class or what sort of person you are is more or less built up to like what you want to do. For example, there is a Wayfarer class, Swordmaster class, and a, let's see, say, Shimmerist class. Shimmerist is basically someone that can copy monster skill. But these aren't really like, these doesn't make up you. It's more you that makes up them, which might not make really any sense. But what it means is that you might just not be a swordmaster who is a wayfarer who also is a shimmerist. You might be a traveling ronin who actually is capable of copying monsters' attacks. That is your class. That is who you are. Not these three classes together, but one particular one. There are a few examples within this game. Let's see here if I can find one. Let's see here. Yeah, for example, they did have an example class they call a Valkyrie, which of course it does sound like a class. You are the female Valkyrie of this place. But what a Valkyrie is an elementalist, guardian, and a weapon master. Because you're capable of using magic, but also defending people and you're good in fighting. So all of these three makes who you are, rather than you basically gonna have to fill their boots. I might have said it before the other way around, but this is kind of what I like with this because there is so much mix and matching. I know that in many other games you can have different classes together with your main, but it's more of a main and side. These all are equal and these all makes who you are. And then for creating these classes, it's not that too much it's not that difficult. Because at the start you basically gonna want to get your attributes. And what they have there is basically three different ways of doing it. And that's because of the ways how the dice sizes works. You have the jack of all trades, which means that all of your attributes has the 8-sided dice. And as you notice, 8, 8, 8, and 8. Everything is there is equal. Then you have the average one, which for example means you want to be stronger. You can basically put a d10 on might, 2 d8s on dexterity and insight, and then a d6 on willpower. As you notice, you remove from one side and go up to another. But because the lowest you can go is basically a d6, you can't really take one more from that. Because then you also have the specialized attribute setting, which is 2 10s and 2 6. What I understand, you can't go further than 10, and you can't go underneath 6, which allows you to basically just say that you can remove one die size and add to the other, but you cannot go beyond 10, which is just add to one of them, and you cannot go below 6, which means remove one from one of them. So I kind of like that because it doesn't need that you do a lot of math. You have like 5 different things you can choose between, like a value of 15, and you're gonna have to put all of these 15 into your attributes. Here it's just you start with 4 8s, remove, and give depending on what you feel for. Do you want to be strong? Do you want to be fast? smart, or clever, depending on what you want. Now, for the HP and stuff, of course, I did say all of these games have math. It's always gonna have math. This one isn't too difficult. Every character, most of the times, if you don't want to start further into the game, basically starts at level 5. There is no level 1, there's only level 5 and up. And what you basically do is that your HP, when you create a character, is basically your level plus 5 times your might. So let's easily say that we do the average class and you have a might of 10. Then you basically just get 50 plus those 5 levels. So you got a HP of 55. Same for mana. 5 times willpower plus your level, which is the most difficult. You only need times and plus. It's rather simple to do that. Defense and magic defense are two different things here as well, which kind of works the same as many other tabletop RPG. It's not how much defense you have, it is whether or not you can hit them. For example, let's just say, don't remember what it's called, but for example, the D&Ds. I know I discussed that with another viewer sometime on my stream, that it feels a bit odd that if a value is big, even though you might have no armor, it would be difficult to hit you. And that's because in many tabletop RPGs, it's not really a value of defense, it's a value of if you're capable of defending yourself. So, for example here, defense and magic defense, which is two of these, is based upon dexterity and insight. Dexterity for defense and magic defense is insight. So if whenever you use a magic on an enemy, if you're capable of being above their magic defense, you hit them. If you're lower, that doesn't mean that you miss them, or it doesn't mean that they have so much magic that you don't hit them. It depends on what's going on, like if it is a fast creature or if it is a slow creature. It might just like be immune to magic and things like that. But these two are one of the simplest thing to actually calculate because, as I said, it's just the size of your dexterity dice and the size of your insight dice, which is really, really simple to do. And then we have, for example, the initiative. Initiative most of the times is just 1, but that's because initiative rolls is basically based upon, I believe, dexterity and insight, but I could be wrong. Also, it might be that depending on what the game master wants, it might be that. Depending on, like, for example, let's easy to say you battle in a torrent of water. That doesn't mean that you need to be fast or you need to see what you're doing. It might be that you need to be fast and need to be strong on your legs. Let's easy to say you fail that. That just means that the enemy goes first. Just a dexterity and might check. But then you also add your initiative because that could be depending on what's going on. Now, the customization of this game, like just every sort of thing, I kind of like it. For a person that really has problems building their own world and like trying to figure out where I could add things, where I could do things, and what I could add without having problems with like being too overpowered, too often, too fast. I do like the customization of this game because they give you a few rule sets of how to create characters, whether they are NPCs or monsters. Because the NPCs, you basically create them similar to your players, except that you don't choose a class. You basically choose what sort of race there are. They could be a monster, they could be a human, they could be an elemental, and things like that. But you still give them the same sort of amount of... I've not heard it, but... Ah, yes, the level up. I completely forgot about that. That is a good topic. In this game, it is a bit, I would say, odd. Because I have checked it sometimes on the Foundry. And by leveling up, and let's see here if we can find There we go, experience and levels. So basically, there are a few rules of how to level up in this game. And that is that for each time you play this game, you gain 5 levels. So in the end of the session, you get 5 levels. You will get a certain amount of experience depending on how many ultima points a villain spend. For example, it's a bit of a, the villain can, for example, escape. But that just makes you stronger because you want to defeat them. And then if you, for example, spend a fabula point, if a player spent a fabula point to do something to help them, you also gain an experience from that. So let us easily say that you had one battle where you had to use a fabula point. And then you also end the session. That means that you will get 6 experience from actually that whole session. So most of the time you just get 5 experience. But depending on what's going on and what you do, you will get more. Now, leveling up. I am a bit uncertain about that because I have not seen so much of when to get. Here we go. So basically you will always level up for each 10 experience. So it's not that difficult to level up. You basically could level up per every second session, which is in a sense good. And this game isn't that too difficult. Like, you have a maximum limit of 50 levels. So you could still do a lot of playing before you get there, and depending on what you need to do. And when you level up, you basically receive a lot of benefit. You could change your identity or theme, which is mostly just cinematic. It is who you are. Why are you doing this? For example, you are a princess who wants vengeance because someone killed your father. You can perhaps want to change that from saving your people instead rather than vengeance. So you want to be the hero instead. Then you also increase maximum hit points and mind points, which of course is just normal. And then you have a few extra things, because any NPC or character in this game that reaches 20 or 40 will actually get some extra bonuses. They will get either stronger or stuff like that. For a player, that means that reaching level 20 or 40, you will be able to increase your dice size by 1 to a maximum of 12. Because as I said, the only dice you mostly need in this game is a 6, 8, 10, 12. And then increase a level of your class. I could actually go through a bit more about classes, because there isn't too much to say there. All of them is kind of similar. But basically what it means by a class is that you get certain skills and a certain extras. Let's see here if we can find something. For example, the sharpshooter. When you create the sharpshooter, you will increase your hit points permanently by 5, and you gain a few extras for what you can equip. And as many other tabletop RPGs, you have a certain equipment base. If you have a certain affinity with one, you get advantage and stuff. And this class, for example, give you one. And then you have certain skills. All of these classes has 5 different skills, and some of these skills might just mean casting spells, which means that of course you might have like 10 or 20 different spells. But by leveling up a class, you can choose any of your 3 or 2 classes and basically gain a level to that, because some skills are capable of leveling up, and by that becoming stronger. Because many of these mathematic in these might just say skill level times 2. That just means that if you have level 1 in that skill, you just have 2. If you have 2 in that skill, you have 4. So it depends on. So the skill, like the classes themselves, aren't that advanced, if we say so. They have 5 different skills and a few benefits. And of course, I'm not going to go through all of them, because if you want to go and check them, I do recommend you do check out Fabula Ultima, which personally I do like. I do really enjoy this game. As I said as well, you don't use skills for NPCs, but you do create them as characters because you still have the average jack of all trades and experienced of the attributes 10, 12, and even 6. But all of these different not classes, but like races of monsters have different benefits. For example, a human enemy have the ability to equip. Then for example, then we also have beasts. They aren't really that advanced, if we say so, but they have 4 different skills that you can add to them whenever you create them. Every sort of race you have there, every species you have, does have a certain amount of starting skills. But for example, Construct only have 2 starting skills, while Beasts have 4. And that's because Constructs comes with that they're immune to poison and poison damage and poison status, together with Earth resistance. So they do have a good amount of list, as they often say in this book as well. Is that they do tell you to do things your way. Because many of these NPC skills that you're gonna give them is basically examples. They are very good examples and I use them a lot. But you basically can give them any sort of thing. Damage absorption, crisis effect. Crisis effect is basically something I'm not taking too much, but that is not a big rule setting for this game. Crisis is basically when you go below half HP. That's when you are in a crisis status. Some skills and some magic and stuff like that does tell you when in crisis. That means when you are below half HP. But yeah, so that's like a crisis effect, damage absorption, damage immunity, improved damage, and improved defense and stuff like that. And the same thing with the NPC calculations of HP and stuff. It has the same thing. Level plus 5 times, willpower plus times 5 plus level times 2 sometimes, depending on. So I do like the customization, especially of NPCs. But that's the funny part as well. When you get all the other books, there are a few other extras customizations. In the core book, you actually have the item customization. So they do tell you how to make a good item. Like, for example, you want this kind of item that is, for example, a shield. You want to have this, you want to have that. You want this skill, you want this value for the defense, you want this to be a light, you want this to be 2 shields. Depends on. And then they also be able to calculate how much money that would be, because this might not be a relic or a humongous artifact of a shield, but it might be something you can buy. And it just tells you how much it would cost if you want to create this item or buy them in a store. Then, of course, they do have a little example of creating relics, which is basically just fabulous items that could do wonders. They don't really have too much of an showing of how to do them, because as I talked to one of my friends who are more into tabletop RPGs than I am, and also when I checked YouTube, if you want to create a relic, you kind of want them to let them break the rules sometimes. Not too much, but some things there. So when they tell you about relics here, they could tell you what they could do or how to use them. But other than that, relics is just anything you can think of that might not just destroy the whole world completely. But they do have a few good examples still of when you want to create certain items. Then, of course, in one of the expanses, especially the high fantasy one, you actually have a setting of how making customized weapons. And these are kind of interesting because unlike the core rulebook, which shows you how to make a weapon or items, the custom weapons from the high fantasy expansion does give you some benefits and some nice customizations. For example, the transforming ability, which basically means that the weapon you create could actually transform into another weapon. So you might start with a dagger, and when you use its skill to transform, it changes into a, I don't know, a pistol or a rifle, depending on what you want it to do. So there are very nice customization with that as well. They don't really do have much of prices there. They have a base price, if I don't remember incorrectly, and basically you can just then choose a certain amount of add-ons to your weapon. For example, the customization, because that's one of them. But that, I feel like that is kind of neat, because as for example in Final Fantasy, there are a few transforming weapons, and in other games as well. And even in animes actually. So having the customized weapon, especially showing step 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, I really do like that, because it gives you a bit of extra. It gives you a bit more to do. Then battles, they do have. I'm not gonna complain about how to make battles and NPCs either here, because they have a very simple thing when to creating battles. If you want an easy battle, then you have enemies mine is equal to -1 of how many players, and that is when they are the same level. You want a normal battle, the same as the players. If you want a hard battle, one more than the players. And I like that, because then you don't need to have to calculate, for example, the battle strength for each monster and then add everything together. You basically have a how many are you? What sort of battle do you need? And what sort of enemies are you gonna fight? Then it's like, okay, easy battle. You're in a forest, you're gonna attack a few beasts. Here we have 3 beasts because you're 4 players. There we go. So the customization of battles and stuff like that is really, really fantastic in this game, because they do give you step a step-by-step guide. Of course, that sometimes people just want to do things themselves. They are more than welcome to do it. And that's the thing with these games. These step-by-step guides are from the box, if we say so, out of the box directly thing. And trying to just make your own kind of battle, that's all the way up to you. Even the NPC extra customization does help, because as I talked about before, you have minor and major villains. You might just not want them to be a normal human. They are gonna be a strong human, mostly stronger than the players. So they do actually have the extra customization for NPCs, whether they are elite or champion. Which is basically the champion, if I'm not incorrect, is basically just the size of 2 characters of the same level. So the HP becomes ×2, the MP becomes like +40, something like that. They have a few extra skills. While Elite basically replaces how many people you're gonna fight. For example, you have just one person, but it's an elite person. It's gonna be a normal battle between 4 people, which means that this NPC is gonna have the strength of 4 people, because that's how it works. So I do really like the customization of this game. As I've said, I have checked few other books and few other games, and trying to make your own enemies or on other things, it doesn't really explain too well, because they create a setting where you kind of need to be built in. So if they have monsters, you're supposed to kind of use their monsters. If they have certain weapons, you're gonna use their certain weapons. You can somehow, if you're very good at these kind of games, go through those games and see, oh, but I can basically just make this a bit weaker and basically make it more concealable. So you basically have the same weapon as a certain normal weapon. But other than that, you don't actually have much other customization. So that's what I like with this game, because it gives you a lot of extra things to do. And even the expansions does that. The high fantasy one gives you a bit of extra world building for high fantasy. What you should think about, what should be happening, and what you could do. But not only that, they do give you 4 extra classes, which from someone who has added every class to their own digital tabletop role playing program does take time. And not only that, they did add the techno just recently, where they added 3 more classes. And even in that game, they did add even more than that. They added basically uh, space travel, but also item customization, like weapon upgrades. If anyone has played Final Fantasy VII and knows about these gems, which unfortunately I've forgotten the name of, you basically have those now in the Techno expansion of Fabula Ultima. So, from my point of view, this game I would say is not the easiest. I wouldn't say it's the baby's first tabletop RPG. But if you have read a few tabletop RPGs, if you have played a few of them and feel interested in JRPG games, I would highly recommend this because this is one of the books I read the most. Especially because I actually build this game, this little world myself, based upon this game. So I would say if you want something to just easily read and just check out for yourself, I would definitely recommend Fabula Ultima. I just found it once by chance, and I'm not gonna lie, I am kinda addicted to reading this. But yes, does anyone have any more questions in chat before I might end this podcast? I believe I have gone through at least some of the bases of this game, but if anyone out in chat has any questions of the game, I do want to answer the questions. No problem. That's the funny part about now. I can cut some parts of this out from the probably the video and also the other thing. If you were to rate it from 1 to 10, what would you rate Fabula Ultima as a tabletop RPG? Mm, well, it is the one of the ones I read the most. So in a sense, I would want to say 10. But that would just basically be favorizing this game. It's a good question. I'm trying to think. I'm trying to think of a good number that is not that low. Let's see. Either 8 or 9, because yes, this is one of my favorite, and I feel like it's a very good start. I don't want to say 10 because I feel like I would favorize this game. I probably perhaps do a 9. I'm trying to find why 9, but I would say perhaps like the Fabula Ultima and adding like like cinematic things from a person of my perspective have a bit difficult to. For example, like, oh, I want to use a Fabula point to make this battle not happen. I would feel like I don't know if that's a good idea or bad idea. Would I allow it or not? I feel a bit more explanation of what a cinematic change could be done. So some of these clocks or these cinematic things are kind of confusing for me, but that's because I kind of like to read a step-by-step guide sometimes. Whether they're bad or good, that is not up to me. That is depending on person by person. So I would say 9 just because of these extra things I don't know how to work them myself. Okay, are there skills or a different question? Is the game combat centered or role played centered? First of all, the skill check similar to D&D. In a sense, you could say yes, because in D&D you have a certain limit, like, oh, this has a difficulty level of 10 of doing something specific. That means that you're gonna have a value higher than 10. in D&D, you roll a d20 and add your attribute to that, or your extra thing, because your attribute might be 10, but you only add 2 to your dice. That means that you only need 1 die plus all the attributes or all the extras you need. In this game, you basically have 2 attributes you roll for, and if the dices together becomes more or equal to the check level, you succeed. So I would say yes, they are actually similar, but not the dice rolls, because you don't add any extra numbers most of the time. You basically just take the 2 dices. Of course, there are when you do co-op checks where basically people try to help you, but then then they just do 1 check for themselves. If they succeed, then you get +1, and that's about it. And then the game combat centered or role playing centered. I would say a bit more role playing centered than combat, but keep in mind this, that you are allowed to choose whoever in your team can act. So it has a certain mechanic of tactics. So I would say the combat is rather tactical of, do we want to take too much damage and just go straight on fighting with just swords and shields? Or are we gonna try and figure out another way around? So a lot of role playing, for example, with the movement, as I said before, because at that point you don't move in battle. You technically are stationary, but you perhaps say that you want to do a certain thing. That is basically a lot of role playing. But I'm not gonna say that there aren't any combat centered part of this, because you need to, for example, think of a good way of using your skills or a good way of keeping your teammates safe. So I would say a very half balanced mix between both. I would say half because it's more role playing centered than combat, but a lot of tactic, I would say. Then I heard something about guns or weapons earlier. Wasn't this supposed to be high fantasy, or did I just mishear? Yes. It is both high fantasy, techno fantasy, and neutral fantasy. It depends on what sort of world the game master has created. And of course, if you do play a high fantasy JRPG game, let's easily say a Tales of game. I'm pretty certain they have certain firearms in that game. It might not be a fully automatic rifle. It might not be a high explosion rifle or something like that, but it might be a musket, it might be a one-shot rifle. So yes, there are weapons or guns, of course, in this game, depending on what sort of world you create. For example, I played was it called XY12 or 13 some time ago. For example, that is a bit of a that's a bit of a neutral fantasy, I would say, a mix with high fantasy. And there is actually a guy there with a rifle. Not a very modern one, but a rifle indeed. And not only that, one of these are techno based. And techno based is like Final Fantasy VII. And in there, every sort of cop has a weapon, like automatic rifle. So it depends on. To be honest, most JRPGs are high fantasy tech. It just depends on the technology. Exactly. It absolutely depends on technology. That is, for example, why the techno fantasy is more centered about technology, but still has some powers. That's why in the expansion of techno fantasy, they do say that, for example, we have the elementalist or the arcanist, which is a summoner, might not work the same in techno. So you just need to do something else. For example, let the arcanist be a sort of Digimon tamer. Basically, what you do is you have like some sort of soul of a digitalized thing or an AI, and it makes you stronger. And the elementalist might actually use some sort of like. Oh, also stretching my bones because I saw that. Because the elementalist might have like certain, I don't know, technology based elemental weapons. May have forgotten, but how does attack range work, especially on weapons with ranged attack? Yes, I have not talked about that completely because there isn't really any range to any weapon. That sounds really strange. We thought of us talking about rifles and ranged weapons. But that's because it has more of a type based scenario rather than range based. Because all weapons does the same amount of damage, the same amount of things. And yes, if you for example want to role play that you shoot the lock of something from a mile away, then you can definitely do that. But in combat, ranged and melee only has a specific working depending on how the monsters work. For example, you, as I said before, there are no reaction rules in game, but there are a few skills sometimes monsters can have, and which are based on reactions. So if, for example, you melee attack a wolf, it'd be able to bite you back. But if you range attack it, it won't be able to have the same reaction. And the same thing goes for flying. Flying is basically why there is a ranged attack in this game. Because flying, you won't be able to reach them with melee attacks. They are too high up. It is like a bird just attacking your hair. It basically flies up high, dives down to your hair and attacks it, and then up again. You won't be able to swing your sword against it. And that's why you have ranged weapons in this game. So it hasn't really any sort of range to them. Mostly just in role playing and cinematic way. But in rule setting, it has to do whether they are flying or whether they have a certain ability that works with their melee attacks or their range attacks. So that is how range works in this game. Basically, there is none. And that is why I want to give this game such, in a sense, high number. Because, yes, it might be. It's weird too, since there is no movement, so I assume there is no battle map. Yes, there is definitely no battle map. It is really strange because I do make battle maps for this game because I want to have them in towns, I want to have them somewhere. So you could, of course, have battle maps, but you can basically just do different things. For example, if you are ranged, you can say you go far away and shoot them. If you are melee, you can say you move forward and attack them. But yes, in the sense of battle maps, there are technically none. Because like in the old Final Fantasy game, like, I don't know, first, second, and third, you basically have the allies on the left side and the enemies on the right side. So there is no range, there is just whether you can attack them with a ranged weapon or if you can attack them with a melee weapon. So it's a bit more of attributes and what they are invulnerable or resistant to rather than how far they are. It feels like a lot of Dragon Quest, but a tabletop, honestly. Yes, and that's what I said before, especially with the high fantasy thing, that it was a lot inspired by by Final Fantasy, but it also had a bit of feeling of Dragon Quest. It's kind of like the second edition battles of Tales of Fantasia. A 2D battles of Tales of Fantasia. In a sense, yes. With a difference of movement. Because in that game, as we have played, there is a lot of movement back and forth. But absolutely. That is basically in a sense what it is. If it did have more of a hitbox and like less of a hitbox in that game. Because you are capable of missing both with ranged and with melee on both flying and stationary, like landing monsters. But in the sense of that, yes, because it is based upon these early JRPG games, both the battles and the setting. But other than that, do we have any more questions? Because personally, I do not believe I have much more to add from the game itself. As I said, it was basically mostly gonna be a talk about the basic of it, a few rule sets, a few customizations, and a few settings. But if you want to know the game yourself, then I do suggest to that whoever is actually interested, I'm not sponsored by them. I am not getting paid anything for this. I do this for fun. But if anyone is ever interested of this game, then definitely do check it out. Can you do romance though? Well, it depends on the game master, but probably. I have seen ridiculous things in tabletop RPGs, so it would not surprise me. But there is actually something that has with bonds to do, but not that kind of bonds. You can be friends, enemies, or just people you admire, if we say so. Do weapons in the game matter? Like, are there weapon types? They are weapon types, yes. The only way they matter mostly, what I would think of, is the classes. Some classes have material daggers, material armors, material ranged. It means that stronger melee weapons can only be equipped by that character. So it mostly matters depending on what person you are playing, but other than that, I do not believe so. The type of weapon, not really, but some weapons does have a specific extra. For example, the transformation I was talking about before. But other than that, I am pretty certain there is no difference. Let me just check a little quick look here. Because, for example, we have a sample of rare bows. Some of them does 1 extra damage. Most of them have extra accuracy, immune to shaken, and ranged, 2-handed, 1-handed. Then we have brawling weapons, 1-handed, dexterity, might. Like, personally, it doesn't really matter what sort of weapon. It only depends on if your character can equip them. What I understand. Because there is, for example, the sharpshooter who can equip material bows or material ranged, which means that they can equip any sort of ranged weapon. Any other class can equip other ranged weapon as well, but not material ones if they don't specify that. Sorry, my English sometimes is a bit odd. Specify, that's the name. So not really. Like, it wouldn't really matter too much if I am not fully mistaken. It just has different meanings depending on what sort of person you play as. Some might be better at it and some might not be. For example, some might just have skills for their swords and some might have other things. But yes, I do believe we are done here. If there isn't any other question, of course, I'm gonna sit here for a moment and just answer questions, definitely. And if you have questions while I'm speaking, do not be afraid to ask. Do you plan on doing another one of these streams on other games? Yes. That's a simple question. Yes, this is the first episode. Do not know when I'm gonna have the next, but I am gonna go through a few other tabletop RPGs that I have in my library. That is why this episode is called The Lord's Library. Because I'm not gonna go through games I've not played nor read, because I can't really do that. Do you plan on demonstrating the tabletop RPGs? Unfortunately, I cannot talk like playing on stream. Unfortunately, I cannot really say much about that because I have DM'd once before on a special stream I had, but I'm not really that much good of a DM. And there aren't really that many Fabula Ultima scenarios, and creating scenarios isn't that easy. So unfortunately, I cannot say I'm gonna demonstrate the tabletop RPGs on stream. Unfortunately. This is more of a viewpoint of myself. Trying to do many demonstrations of all of these games would unfortunately be a bit too much to try and deal with. I assume the manuals are expensive as well. Let me check at least some of these manuals, at least the one I'm having now. There we go. Well, do you plan on doing about the Resident Evil board game? I don't have that game, so unfortunately not. That is also a board game and not a tabletop RPG, so I can unfortunately not do that. let's see here. Let's check the Fabula Ultima base game and see what we have there. Let's see. Trying to find if I can find the main thing, but it's kind of difficult. Ah, there we go. So the base game is about $17, $18. So both expensive and not expensive. It's a PDF I own. Imagine a prank stream and just review a board game. Yeah, definitely. But that has been it of the first episodes of the Lord's Library. I do hope you all enjoyed both on stream, on YouTube, and wherever I send this podcast to. And sorry for the scuff, absolutely. I am really new to this, but I really wanted to try this out. Hopefully, I have at least opened a bit of your eyes to Fabula Ultima a bit. It is not meant to be a straight on through explaining the whole game, because as I said, if you want to check this game out yourself, I do recommend that you check it out. But this is more or less to explain the basic. How do you do skill checks? How do you do battles? How do you create characters, and how easy is it to customize the game for yourself? If it has some help, or if you just have to hard work it through yourself. But yes, I do hope you all enjoy, and you are welcome back to the library whenever we open again. Thank you, everybody.